Hello, this is the Overcoming Resistance podcast, and I am your host, Lewis Carell. Today, I'll be talking about stress management and why it matters for results in training and life. I believe it is about as important as some of the other major pillars in the training process, like training, nutrition, and sleep. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show. Hey, everyone, welcome back. Another solo episode here, but I want to take some time to talk about a topic that I personally think is pretty important, but there are some people that I consider much smarter than myself who also view the overall topic to be pretty important. And so that topic today is going to be stress management. So originally, what got me thinking about this topic, not only from a training perspective, but overall life, was Greg Nuckols from the website Stronger by Science. Very smart, knows training. And he really talks about a few global areas that really impact the overall training process and our results. And some of the big ones, a lot of us are familiar with. One, it's the training itself. Two, it's our diet and nutrition. What are we eating? Getting enough protein, calories. Our sleep, are we getting adequate sleep for recovery and restoration? And then the last one that stuck out to me was stress and stress management. So the original article, you can search it online, is by him from Stronger by Science. It's titled, Stress, the Silent Killer of Gains. And it reviewed some research showing that high levels of psychological, mental stress can negatively impact one's ability to recover from training. It basically delays how long it takes to recover from training. So just as an example, say it takes 2 days to recover from a workout, resistance training workout. If you're under a lot of psychological stress, it might take 3 days. Well, you could see how that might be tough if it's an ongoing process for someone. So we're getting ready for a powerlifting meet as a powerlifter. You got all your training days laid out. Usually it's on a 7-day calendar. You've got, maybe under a lower stress environment. You kind of know how well you recover. So you got all your training mapped out going to the meet. But if something happens 6 weeks out that kind of adds a lot of psychological stress from that point onward towards the meet, that can really elongate each recovery time frame for each workout and can kind of diminish your results in kind of a stacking order. The last podcast, I kind of talked about recovery versus adaptation. And so this kind of, in a way, piggybacks off that a little bit in the sense that you don't want that recovery taking longer because that basically does in some way impact your ability to then stimulate adaptations for more results. So kind of trying to relay it to, you guys and kind of seeing why this matters. Now, is it as much of a worry if on a random Monday you have a really stressful day at work and that's not normally the case? Probably nothing I would truly worry about. But if you find yourself in a period of life with a lot of stress, or something's coming up, it's going to be very stressful, it's something to think about because it can alter what you maybe do in training and your results you get from that process. And so, a lot of us that love to train, it's something we find really enjoyable. We're trying to get some of the best results, even if you're more of a lifestyle person or a competitive athlete in powerlifting or bodybuilding. It's pretty rare that training and lifting and all this and this lifestyle that we're all trying to live to some degree is paying our bills. So we're likely dealing with a variety of stressors and they're going to be pretty consistent or variable. And we're going to be dealing with this concept often. Right? You can't just lift. A lot of us don't get the pleasure of just lifting and then relaxing all day. And, something else that you might have come across a lot, especially with how much mental health is talked about these days, which I think is great, is that commonly talked about too is a pretty good starting point for improving mental health is stress management too. And what is important for workplace productivity? You're trying to be productive, you're starting a business, stress management. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I want to preface that, but I know it's a area that got me interested for my lifting, and I found some aspect of this conversation interesting from an educational point and some applied points for not only just my general mental health as well as productivity and job and work in the workplace. Because as of 2019, the World Health Organization did add burnout as an actual health condition and one of the biggest things with burnout, especially workplace burnout, is high levels of psychological stress. So we see it almost triangulates with a lot of not only the training that we care about, but some other areas that most of us care about too. So as I researched this topic, I got very interested and it's something interesting. Now, what's the most common thing we hear talked about when it comes to stress management? We talked a little bit about, well, why does it matter for our results and training, and how can it be impactful for, overall life? But what's the first strategy that's usually talked about? Well, that first strategy is avoid stress. Now, yeah, for sure, avoiding stress will decrease your stress load. But this creates an issue, because generally speaking, if you're someone who's an entrepreneur starting a business, or you have a job that pays really well, usually comes with a lot of responsibility, you have a family, all these areas in life that are pretty important to a lot of us, they come with stress. So, and you can't just avoid it. You can't just not go to, if you just don't do your job, you don't get paid. If you don't spend time with your family, you're not there. So we really can't avoid all the stress. So I think it's a great starting point. It definitely decreases stress load. Avoid the unnecessary stress, toxic relationships, for example. Maybe don't get into online debates with people that, it doesn't really matter, watching TV shows and movies that upset you. Sure, that's a great starting point. But once you do that, a lot of us still have a lot of stress. And so where do we go from there? Now, when I was researching this topic, I came across the psychologist Kelly McGonigal, and she's the author of the book, The Upside of Stress. And she had a quote, and it really stuck out to me, and is that a meaningful life is a stressful life. So that makes sense, right? When you think about family, career, even training, competing, a lot of stuff we find meaningful in some way can be stressful. So, I wanted to look further. If we can't avoid it, and that's usually the most common suggestion for stress management is avoid, and it's still a lot of load and it's impacting you, then what can you do? And that's what I want to talk about today. Like, what can we do, and why would this help? And so, let's first talk about just a couple definitions. First, I want to talk about not all stress is equal. So there's the concept of eustress. This is generally stress that we perceive as beneficial or is beneficial. What's a common eustressor? Exercise. The research is pretty clear. If you do moderate amounts of exercise, aerobic and resistance training improves longevity, and very good for overall health, mental health. Well, exercise is a stressor. It just happens to be in moderate amounts a eustress. So it provides benefit as a stressor. Well, what is distress? That's usually a stressful day at work, right? That usually makes you feel bad. It's usually something perceived as negative. Overtraining, right? We can bring this back to a training perspective. Doing too much training can be considered a distressor. So, exercise and training can be eustress, it can be distress. And this is also something to think about too, is that even a single stressor, depending on its amount applied, can have some different effects too. But if we realize in both of those definitions, there is some concreteness. It can be beneficial if it's a eustressor. It can be negative if it's a distressor. But some of it is also interpretation based. So eustress can be a stressor we interpret as beneficial. Distress can be a negative stressor that we interpret as a negative. So that got me interested in the fact that, okay, so maybe there's a perception effect that we can explore. And a great book, again, that really goes into a lot of some of the information I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail, is The Upside of Stress. I think it's a great book. I've read it. Fantastic. So, something to think about is, can perception matter? And the first study I saw that got me interested is they were looking at mortality. So the risk of passing away. And they found, and they kind of categorized people into some different areas. So it's kind of like, do you have a lot of stress? Do you not have that much stress? Objectively, like load. And then they looked at, okay, and how do you perceive that stress? Kind of like good or bad. And so then they, obviously it categorizes people in different ones. They could be high stress, view as bad, high stress, view as good. It could be low stress, view as bad, low stress, view as good. The worst one for mortality was high stress, view as bad. But oddly enough, someone having low stress and viewing it bad was pretty similar to someone having high stress and viewing it good. So, okay, so they have a high load, but their perception of it changes maybe what the outcome is. And there is some physiological reason for that. So when we get stressed out, what's the main thing everyone thinks happens? We release cortisol. Really, I think vilified unnecessarily. But cortisol does a few things. It gives you energy. One of the reasons when you first wake up and you feel energized in the morning is a natural cortisol release. So it helps liberate energy that's stored, releases, neurotransmitters like epinephrine, norepinephrine, helps release, stored energy reserves. We can make ATP to make energy. So it does have a reason. So when you're stressed out, cortisol gets released, helps you rise to the demand of the stressor. And that's a good short-term effect. However, of course, there is data showing that long-term high cortisol can certainly be negative in the body. And that's because the way cortisol binds to some receptors, if it's high for too long, it can kind of misbind to some receptors, starting to have, instead of an anti-inflammatory effect, it starts to have a pro-inflammatory. It can maybe dysregulate the way we process the food we eat because it's kind of prioritizing some like liberation of energy, and it's not really allowing us to digest and process and put food where we need it. Because when you're, for example, if you're trying to build muscle, lifting is stressful, but like where's the recovery coming from? The rest digest process, which is usually best done with not a lot of cortisol, because cortisol is associated with a fight or flight response. Low cortisol is more associated with like a rest digest, which is where we can really process food, build muscle tissue. So in the short term, it's good, but in the long term, we don't want high cortisol. But if you actually look at some of the data on people, when they actually take blood markers and actually look to see, well, okay, what happens if they undergo a stressful event in a study and they view stress as bad? What does their blood look like? Well, of course, they got high cortisol. But when they view stress as good under the same kind of event, then they actually end up with not only high cortisol, but high dihydroandrosterone sulfate. That's another adrenal hormone. So cortisol is an adrenal hormone, and DHEAS is another adrenal hormone. Now, what's interesting is when we're stressed out and we release both together, they work synergistically. So some of the downsides that people think about with cortisol are actually managed by the presence of DHEAS. So now we start to see, well, okay, so there's some physiological underpinning that makes sense why, when we look at some of this broader data, we do see that when people are stressed out and they view it as good, there is actual differences in how they respond to that. And so this could be a big one. DHEAS is also a precursor to hormones like testosterone. So some potential, we don't want that low necessarily, especially as somebody who's like a natural athlete. So now we start to see maybe, some data showing more longevity effects, some physiological effects, and so we definitely want to potentially start trying to view stress, if we can, as beneficial instead of viewing it as negative, especially if we can't avoid it. Because that's another management technique, and not one that I hear talked about often. They see these kind of like this mental perception kind of play out in a lot of different areas. There's even some research showing that in like individuals who clean like hotels, they did a study where they took one group who thought that, their physical labor job was bad for their health. And then they took another group doing the same job, but they educated them that they're basically getting almost like exercise from it. And then they actually saw like differences in like their physical appearance and how they felt and their energy, just simply through altering some of that perception of what they were going through, the physical stressor of, physical movement being good versus bad in these people. So there's several lines of research, and I'll link some below in the description, so if you want to like look at some of this in a little bit further. And so, well, how do we practically do that, right, in the moment? Well, one could be self-talk. So an example, you got an event coming up. You're a powerlifter doing a meet. You're nervous for your first attempt. Well, what is another state that feels very similar to being nervous? Excited. If you actually take a second to think about that kind of almost anxious energy effect is very much the same basic underpinning of both of those, but it's a categorization difference. And that will affect the choices you make. If you're nervous, that typically puts people a little bit of an avoidance state. They don't really want to do it. People generally don't want to do things they're nervous doing. But if you're excited, now you might be proactive. You might try to do the thing. You might be wanting to go attempt it. So you could do some reframing and self-talk to try to recategorize emotions. Next, you can start to work on your overall mindset. So there's two big mindsets here, which can be important to think about. There's the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. So the basic idea here is that a growth mindset is that one views their abilities as not set in stone. They can be improved over time. This is important because if this is something you kind of believe in yourself, then you're more accepting of changes that come across over time, especially throughout life, which are going to happen. And you're also more likely to be proactive in doing things to improve whatever the situation is. Okay, you're a powerlifter. Bench press is your weakest of the three lifts. If you believe that your abilities are not set in stone, you can become a much better bench presser. You're going to proactively do the things, seek coaching, try things out, and do everything you can to become the best bench presser you can be. But if you kind of accept it along the fixed mindset idea, and let's say you think it's genetic, then you might just kind of not try that hard. So maybe you aren't going to be the best bench presser ever. But if you say you bench 315, who's to say with a lot of trial, error, belief, and time, you couldn't bench 405. But if you don't think it's in the cards, you think genetically you can't because it's a fixed mindset. And the definition of that is basically the opposite of growth, where you don't think your abilities can change. You think they are set in stone. Then why try? So this is another perception shift where if we focus on a growth mindset, whether it's a job, right? You want to make more money, so you believe you can acquire more skills to improve your utility in your position. You can become a better family member to strengthen your relationship with family, or a better partner and improve relationships with your partner. You can become a better athlete, and you can learn more, apply more, try new things, and you can improve your results. Because there's many ways to do this overall process of lifting, training, diet. If you're competitive or just lifestyle, right? But if you believe that, it's all genetic, you can't really change, your habits are forever, then you might not even really try that hard. And so, of course, you're not going to get probably the results you want, right? So there's a little bit of that mindset leading to action. Another option that you can do is many of us have a social circle. And I encourage that if you're under a stressful event, try reaching out. Again, I want to preface, I'm not a psychologist, but reaching out and leaning on those that are in your social circle, your support system, can be good. When we're under stress and we're reaching out and bonding with people to help get through that, that can release the hormone oxytocin. It's a bonding hormone. It makes us feel good. It increases, helps increase social interaction. And that can help mitigate some of the negative effects of stress too. So, we talked about some mindset, some self-talk, and then we talked about, what's trying to lean on those that are in our social circle when appropriate. And sometimes if you can't lean on people, nothing wrong with therapy. A therapist is a great resource. I've used one many times myself, and that could be useful as well. Just something to maybe consider from a supplemental route. It's definitely not my first place to go, but the herb ashwagandha does have some decent clinical data coming out showing that it kind of works through this overall classification of herbs being called adaptogenic. So basically, they're going to provide a small cellular stressor, which then causes the body to react and become more resilient. And then with that resilience, it's better prepared to handle an actual stressor that comes. So it kind of enhances the stress resilience response. And some of the human data does show like improvements on perceived stress scores, lower cortisol levels, higher DHEAS levels. There's even some, and I don't think it's as strong, but even some early data in athletes maybe showing better power output, enhanced adaptations to exercise, improved strength, motor control. And a lot of that might just come from its ability to kind of help manage stress, the fatigue from stress on a more global sense. Two trademark extracts, Sensorial and then KSM 666. If you want to look them up, they have some data there. So that could be maybe a supplemental option to use, again, for periods, are coming, or if you're in a period, alongside obviously working on, stress load. And then of course, some of the things we talked about with more like perception and management. But that was a shorter episode for you guys. That's everything I really had to kind of share on this shorter topic. So please let me know, if you like these shorter episodes, or kind of briefly going over a general concept. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating and review wherever you are listening, if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast. If on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please let us know if you did or didn't like the episode, and all feedback is helpful. We will be releasing another episode 2 weeks from now. You can find us at Overcoming Resistance on YouTube and at Overcoming_Resistance on Instagram. Have a great day and take care.